There was once a king, and he worked hard for the good of his people, and he worked hard every day, through the weeks, past the months and into the years, until one day he got up, as he did every day, and he walked over to the bowl of water that was there waiting for him, as he did every day, and he washed his face, as he did every day. But then, unlike other days, a little strand of last night's dream came into his mind, and he stopped, and he thought, and he smiled. And when he looked back into the bowl of water, the water had stilled, and he saw his reflection, but it wasn't the reflection that he expected to see. The crows had left footprints by his eyes, and there was white hair peppered in amongst the black, and his neck, well, it had grown baggy and stretched like a turkey, and as he looked at his reflection, he realised that he had grown old. Well, he didn't mind being old. He'd had a good life, but there was one big problem. He'd been so busy looking after all of his people, looking after the land, that he'd never had time to get married. He'd never had any children, and who was going to rule the land when he died? Well, he thought through everybody that he knew. He thought through all his advisors, all the people that lived in the castle and the palace. No one person seemed any more fit to rule than anybody else. There was only one thing for it. He was going to have to hold a competition. Well, he sent his messengers out throughout the land, telling the people when the competition was going to be, and that it was going to be open to everybody, whether they were rich or poor, whether they were male or female, whether they were young or not quite so young. That was the only thing, was that you had to be younger than the king, because if you were older, well, there would be no point. Soon the whole country was buzzing with excitement about the competition, and in ones and twos people started to arrive in the grounds of the palace. All the wise men and women had come, because, well, you do need to be wise to rule a kingdom. And so they sat sparring one another at chess and asking one another riddles underneath the shady trees. And then all the strong men and women, well, they came too, and they started wrestling and practising their sword play, because you need to be strong to be a king or a queen. But it wasn't just the wise and the strong that were gathering at the palace. Soon everybody from all over the country was gathering, all dressed in their finest clothes, the ladies with hats with flowers and fruit and feathers on them. And on the day of the competition itself, the whole of the ground of the palace was packed, heaving with people, and amongst everybody else was one small boy. And he too, he'd come in his finest clothes, but, well, they were a little bit short for him on the arm, and the knees had started to get a little bit grazed and ripped. And as he looked around at everybody else in their finery, as he looked at the strong men and the wise women, he started to think there was nothing, no competition that he could possibly win against all of these other people. And he was about to turn and to leave, when suddenly a hush came down over the crowd. All eyes turned to the palace, and up onto the parapets came the buglers, and they put the bugles to their mouths. Da, 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 da. The great oaken doors of the palace swung open, and there, resplendent in his robe and his crown, was the king himself, and next to him the master of ceremonies, dressed in his red jacket, and he sucked the air into his belly and said, "Let the competition begin." Well, the king himself stepped forward, and even with so many people you could have heard a pin drop as everybody hung on the king's every word. He lifted his hand up into the air, and he said, "In my hand I hold a bag of seeds, and any of you who would like to be the next king or queen, I will give you a seed. And you must take that seed, you must plant it and care for it for 6 months. And at the end of that time, bring your plant, whatever the fruits of your labours are, back to me, and then I will judge who is to be the next king or queen." Well, everybody started talking and turning to their neighbour. This wasn't the sort of competition they'd expected to decide who was going to be the next ruler. But there was one person who was delighted. That boy, that one small boy. His parents were farmers. If there was one thing he knew how to do, then surely it was how to grow a seed. And so, as all the people were pushing and jostling to make their way into a bigger line and a big queue to file in front of the king, he took his place and he waited his turn. And at last, it was him to go and see the king. And he went to the king, he smiled, he held out his hand, the seed was put into his hands, he curled his fingers around it, and then he was off, running as fast as he could back home. And as soon as he got home, he put that seed very carefully, safely up onto a windowsill. And he went and he got himself a plant pot, and he was going to make the best compost that he could. And first of all, he went to his father's best field, and he took some of the topsoil from that field, and then he went to the manure heap, where all the piles of cow poo and horse poo were left to rot, and it was just gently steaming in the sunshine. And he took a great big handful of well-rotted manure, he mixed it all in. Then he went back to his seed, made a little hole, dropped the seed inside, patted the earth down, he watered it well, and left it in a place that caught the morning and the evening sun and missed the noonday heat. And then he did the hard part. He waited. And the next morning, the first thing that he did was to run down the stairs, to run outside to see if there was anything growing in his pot, any green shoot or white sprout. There was nothing. But then it was the first day, and seeds do take a little bit of time. And the next day it was the same. The first thing he did was to run down the stairs, outside. Still nothing. The third day his hopes were really up. Surely by now something would be starting to sprout, but there was nothing but a pot of dirt and manure. And a week went by. 2 weeks went by. And the boy, he tried giving the pot more water. He tried letting it dry out. He tried moving the pot to a place that it got more sun, and then he tried putting it in the shade. And the months ticked by. The boy, he tried everything that he could think of, and every day, the first thing that he did was to run downstairs, to go outside to check on his pot. Every day, nothing but a pot of dirt and manure. Until at last, it was the day of the competition itself. And with one last forlorn hope, he made his way down the stairs, outside to check on the pot. Nothing. Well, he went back inside and he sat down at the table. And his mum and dad looked at him and said, "What are you doing? Isn't today the day of the big competition? Why aren't you dressed in your best clothes?" He said, "Well, I'm not going, there's no point. Why should I go? Why should I go and take a pot that's got nothing in it but dirt and manure?" And they said, "But you've tried so hard. What difference will one more day make? Go to the palace, see everybody else's plants, enjoy your day." Well, the boy didn't really feel very much like enjoying himself, but his parents had a point, and he went and he put his best clothes on, and he went outside and he picked up that pot and he set his foot to the road, and he started to walk in the direction of the palace. And the closer and closer that he got to the palace, while the more and the more people there were on the road, and every single one of them was carrying a pot. Some of them great big pots full of big red and yellow and orange blooms, and others had little tiny pots with little white flowers that smelt beautiful. Others had long green trailing vines, but he was the only one that was carrying nothing but a pot of dirt and manure. And he started to hunch over so that people wouldn't see there was nothing in it. And his feet dragged on the road, getting slower and slower and slower. And so it was that he was the very last person to arrive at the palace. And he arrived just as that hush fell down over the crowd, as all the eyes turned towards the palace, as the buglers came out onto the parapets, put their bugles to their lips. Da-da-da-da-da. The great oak doors opened. There was the king himself, there was the master of ceremonies, and the master of ceremonies sucked the breath in. "Let the judging begin." The king stepped forward, and everybody was pushing their way to be first before the king to show him their beautiful plants. One by one they filed past the king, and one by one the king, he nodded, and he smiled at them. But he spent no more time with any one person than the next person in line, and as more and more people went past, slowly you could see that smile was starting to get a little bit faded around the edges. While the boy, he was right at the end of the queue, and he had plenty of time to start thinking, and he was starting to get nervous. And those butterflies, well, they were turning to snakes inside his stomach. And he was thinking, what if the king thinks I haven't tried? What if the king thinks I haven't taken his competition seriously? Well, what if I make the king angry? He'd heard about kings, and he'd heard what sort of things happened to the people who made him angry. And he started worrying that maybe as soon as the king saw that pot with nothing but dirt and manure, well, he'd end up throwing the boy in a dungeon or worse. And then it was his turn. And somebody pushed him from behind, and the boy, he tried to scoot past the king as quickly as he could, hunched over his pot. But he wasn't quick enough. Down came a great big hand, and it landed on his shoulder. It turned the boy around, and the boy, fearfully, he looked up right into the king's eyes. The king was looking down at him. The king was smiling, and he said, "You will be the next king." Me? But I brought you nothing but a pot of dirt and manure. The king started to laugh, and he said, "You know what? Before I gave out those seeds, I took the whole bag of them, the whole lot of them, and I boiled them for a day and a night. Not one of those seeds should have grown as much as a blade of grass. And yet you are the only one out of all these people who has had the courage and the honesty to come before me with nothing but a pot of dirt. And so you will be the next king."